I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. Now, today I have a very special guest, a friend of mine that I've gotten to know over the last few years, knows quite a bit about churches, small churches, dealing with that, and has just recently completed a study, I'll call it a research project, something fun for him, let's just call it that. And so I'm going to let you introduce yourself, James, and then give us a little bit of overview of what you've been doing. You can include your own history, anything that you want, just get us started. And then I've got a few questions. We'll go from there.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks, Ron. So I have been involved in research projects related to the church now for almost 2 decades.
Okay,
And
and you're James Watson, who
I'm James
yes,
Watson.
that is
Yes.
he, yes.
And so having looked at the relationship between the churches and immigration in Canada, and having looked at tent makers, people who are co-vocational, multivocational, bivocational, who have a pastoral leadership role as well as some other kind of employment. And this year I was able to take advantage of a research fellowship that is provided by the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research at Wycliffe College at University of Toronto to do a year just focused on research, and was given a fairly broad range of options to consider underneath the theme of starting new churches in Canada. So church planting, new churches starting, kind of in January is kind of like, go, what are you going to do? And so very thankful to have an opportunity to be able to focus like that, and to have some opportunity to explore some of the areas that I'm aware from having been a coach and trainer of church planters for a couple decades now. And so there's a few projects that fall under that bigger banner. So one of the major projects that the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research has taken on is looking at the Canada Revenue Agency information that gets recorded by every charitable organization in order to maintain charitable status with the Canadian government. And so of the 85,000 or so charitable organizations, that's been sorted to find the congregations. And within that, I've had opportunity to look at, okay, well, which congregations seem to have their start since 1991? They only registered after 1991, and then have continued up until 2021. And so found about 200 to 450 new congregations registered every year.
Oh, really?
With the Canada Revenue Agency over that 30-year span.
That's quite a number. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, as a researcher on the church in Canada, to actually have a baseline like that is that comprehensive. What I did to complement my looking at numbers was almost every Sunday I've gone to a different new congregation in Waterloo region. And that's where I live. It's also an interesting region in terms of having sort of 3 medium-sized cities and some rural area, and within the commuting distance of the greater Toronto area. And so there I've had a chance to visit 30 new congregations, attend their worship service, just observe and have a chance to get some of the flavor of what's going on within one region. The other component is that I've gone to my colleagues at the Church Planting Canada Network and beyond in terms of denominational organizations that have a plan, they have stated intention, they have policies around starting new congregations in Canada, and asking them, like, how does this work for you within your tradition, the way that your organization functions? What do you consider has been essential in working through a plan to start new congregations? And so those are sort of the 3 major areas that I've had in focus as I've been going through this year.
Now, when you talk about the 30 churches that I'll call it had personal contact with. Uh, what sizes are we looking at here? I'm going to guess most of them are small.
So the ranges of the 30, there were three that were over 150 people in attendance that morning.
That okay. And so out of the 33, so the rest of them, the 27 are under 150, started within the last 10 years.
That's correct.
Okay, two questions arise out of that immediately for me. Number one, how do you get over 150 to 200 or maybe more in 10 years? And why not just say you'll be a small church for a while if you're going to be planting a church? Okay, go from there.
So I didn't always have access to their intentions or their history
Hmm.
because I was attending a worship service. But some of them presented some of that either on their website or as part of them
Oh, yeah.
sharing who they are as a congregation or as a movement. And some of them, people took time afterwards when they knew that I was interested and just shared with me what their story was and how God had been at work at leading them through the different steps they'd taken. And I would say that there's a mix of congregations there. Some which I assume from my visit are intending to be small over
Hmm.
the long term. One was a Sunday morning worship service in the back room of a storefront in a mall.
Hmm.
And the storefront was actually a prayer and deliverance ministry.
Oh, okay.
They offered prayer ministry out of a storefront in the mall. It was set up sort of like a medical clinic might be, except there was Christian art and um, scripture verses up on the wall.
Yeah.
And the pastor there had been functioning that way apparently for about 10 years from reading the website. And she offered this worship service. There's one family, it looked like they'd just come from the martial arts studio down the hallway into the Sunday morning worship. And I assume that's not there's no plan there to develop a mega church. This is something that complements what's being done in terms of deliverance and prayer ministry. There's sort of a holisticness to how they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, you're starting to sort of venture into a whole thing that I've had, having just recently moved to a larger center, to Calgary from a small town. I've been venturing around just trying to figure out what is happening with churches, and particularly, yeah, as you talk about church plants over the last 10 years, there's quite a there's a difference, I think. One is the very innovative style, if you want to call it that. Then the other is, well, let's start with a group of people that we know can sustain this, keep it going. We're financially stable. We've got a great vision. We're going to do this. Are you running across that type of differences in some of these church plants and small churches that are happening?
There is a lot of diversity in the church plants. As I think about the research report that I completed for the Institute based on these visits to new worship services, I took the image of the kaleidoscope.
Okay.
Canada has often had an image of a mosaic
Hmm.
where there's sort of beautiful pieces of like pottery or glass that are cemented into a pattern that makes this beautiful pattern.
Yeah.
And that's been a bit of a ideological stance for Canada for a while. Let's all contribute our own cultural identity and make this beautiful picture. And my experience of visiting the congregations is that they're actually grappling with something that's, I think, a little bit more accurate and more complex. And that's the idea of a kaleidoscope, where we've taken those different pieces and put them into a tumbler with mirrors and held it up to the light. And you get these beautiful, like, diverging and converging images
Hmm.
as the different pieces overlap. And so I think I came away encouraged that the church in Canada actually is responding to that kind of complexity with the very different kinds of new congregations that are starting and seeking to engage with people in the community who are coming from very different places. And, if they're recent immigrants, they're experiencing a lot of cultural change as they decide how they are finding their own place within this region within Canada. So I was quite pleased to see how much diversity was actually present.
Now, even what you have talked about for your own background, your research has talked about immigrants. You've talked about various. It seems like you're on the edge of understanding where our society is, and a number of us are 5 or 10 years behind, maybe 20 years behind, trying to understand how best to move into our communities and church planting and what church needs to look like. What do you think?
So I think that with Canada having such a strong emphasis on immigration,
Mm-hmm.
that there's different places that have been more popular places for immigrants to land, and then sometimes certain places have been very popular to settle. And so Statistics Canada has been tracking sort of how immigration is relating to Canadian communities now for several decades. And when you look at some of the patterns, you realize that there's a lot of change happening. Some of it has to do with finding employment
Mm-hmm.
opportunities. Some of it has to do with where do you already have family or friends, support networks that can assist you in learning how to develop sustainability within a new country. And some of it, when I've been talking to people, for certain urban centers, housing prices have been a factor
Oh,
as
definitely.
well.
Yeah.
Like where do you find reasonable housing for yourself, for your family? And so all of these things have contributed to a lot of mobility. And so we see a lot of change in Canadian communities. And while I think it's easy to consider this to be sort of an urban phenomenon, because a lot of employment opportunities present themselves in urban environments, we have a lot of rural communities where people are showing up. I grew up on a farm on a gravel road in southwestern Ontario, and one of our neighbors moved from Bramalea, where he had sort of landed as an immigrant, and moved into the small 3 hectare just acreage beside the
Yeah.
farm, and decided they wanted to have a place, some space for family.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're starting to see this happening in different ways in different communities across Canada. And so this issue of not just cultural diversity, but cultural change
Right.
and what it means to respond to the changes that are around us is becoming really important.
Yeah, and I've noticed that, well, even in my birthplace, the place where I ministered and retired actually for a number of years, uh, it was monocultural for most of my early days, and now has thriving communities. The one that I dealt with and loved being with was a Filipino community, and they were not a small community in an area that was small population, but they were a good part of the community. And we had to, the whole community had to begin to understand what is it to be multicultural, or whatever term we're going to use nowadays to understand that. So how do we understand that? Let me make up an example here. A church that started 30 years ago, monocultural, uh, let's call them very Bible believing, strong, conservative. They're now in a situation where the the church building is uh, there aren't a lot of white people around anymore. It's Indian, it's Chinese. What do you do?
So that question is a big one for congregations that have a very well established identity,
Right. Hmm.
right? Because they have to make decisions about, okay, what is our mission? When they ask the question of who are we, when they ask the question, who are our neighbors,
Hmm.
and then ask the question of who has God called us to be. You
Three
know,
great
I
questions. Yeah.
I am hoping that those sort of play into their discernment
Mhm.
about what their future could look like. But it can sometimes be really challenging to work through those changes. There was one of the church plants I was tracking that appeared to be an independent, excuse me, independent congregation prior to the pandemic. And when I went to visit the location, it was an established church building. And I learned from the website that they had a new name for the church that was not yet on the external wall of the building. The old name was still in the building. And what had happened is a longer, older, established, largely seniors church had been renting during the pandemic to a highly multicultural church of young families that had been a church plant. And during the pandemic, they had some conversations. The couple sitting up in front of me explained this history, and they seemed quite excited by these changes, where they just said, well, could we become one church? And so they actually merged. And it was amazing to see sort of the diversity of generations, of cultures on the platform, in the pews, and to hear someone who is, one of the seniors of the older established church saying how grateful they were to God for this opportunity, that they had young families, that they had these different cultural perspectives that were enriching their congregational experience. So these kinds of changes can happen, but they're not always easy for all churches to work through.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found was a number of these new congregations were able to sort of zero in on some specific cultural experiences, identities, ways of looking at things that allowed people to engage in a way that might be difficult for a more established older congregation to adapt to quickly.
Yeah. Now, you've also touched base with a number of denominational leaders. Um, what have you found they're discussing? What are they talking about when they talk about church planting, small churches, well, all those areas? Let's go for that.
So I encountered sort of three very general strategies, I'll call them.
Okay.
um, and so the one general strategy was, we have a process that we work through, but we're going to work with all sorts of different models, all sorts of different leaders to try and help them as they're establishing a new congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found some who said, we want to, and this was two in particular, were very clear about what their vision was, that said, we want to establish something that's over 100 attendees as quickly as possible, because we want to have a kind of resilience within the congregation that starts, so that it's not a matter of that this just starts and then has difficulties and disappears. We want them to have capacity, right? So as you know, it can make a big difference if two families leave a congregation of less than 50, as opposed to two families leaving a congregation of 100 or more.
Yeah.
It changes the dynamics dramatically. And so they were emphasizing resilience and seeing congregational size as a way to enable a kind of resilience and long steadiness within the community.
Mm-hmm.
I also talked to a couple of groups who were very strong on, we're going to start with something, whatever the idea is, and start off small and see how that can develop. And so for some, it was sort of experiments they were talking about. They would work with someone who has a dream, help them discern what that could look like. What would sustainability mean for this specific experiment? Mm-hmm. And what might be next stages of development? And another group I talked to had sort of decided to focus in on micro churches.
Okay.
And for them, micro church meant empowering local leaders to invite neighbors into a spiritual community. And so sort of what in the past we might have called house church, right, or simple church, but having that small identity that enables people who might not feel like they had all the professional expertise to be a pastor of a 100-person congregation, but to feel like they could offer something of discipleship within their own local networks and relationships within their community, their region, their municipality, their neighborhood.
Okay, so how do all of those churches, styles, forms, formats work together?
So for some, like the denominational movement,
Hmm.
was deciding, here's what we're going to focus on for now,
Yeah.
right, as our way forward. And for some, they said, we're going to have a mixed bag of different opportunities for people and work this out as we go. And so a lot of that really emphasized the relationship. So having a good relationship with the leaders involved allowed for the offering of resources, allowed for accountability,
Hmm.
allowed for an opportunity to have discussion about, well, what are the needs of this specific community?
Okay. So let me move to another question. When I think of small churches, um, we've seemed to have done a fairly good job of understanding a rural small church in the past. Relationship based, strongly a group that seems to get together, hang together, and stays for a while, and then invites people in. They come in, and they're expected to be part of what's happening. Is there a sense in which churches nowadays, particularly small churches, and have to say we're starting, but we may not be the same as we were 10 years ago or 20
Mm.
years ago? What kind of mindset do we need now in small churches?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Not so much from my research specifically, but
Hmm.
more from my lived experience. I would say that both rural communities and urban communities, the mobility factor is huge for small congregations.
Hmm.
So I attended what you would classify as a small church in a small town in rural southwestern Ontario, and then I went away for university, and then I got caught up in a church plant in a city in Kitchener,
Hmm.
and so did not return to my home community, did not return to my small congregation that had cared for me very well. Like
Yes.
they were very kind to me, and I'm very thankful for them in my life. I actually was just preaching at the 171st anniversary service
All right.
about 2 months ago, and I've noticed with urban congregations I've visited, the mobility factor also affects them. People get work in another area, and so they have to move. They have housing decisions they have to make, so they have to relocate.
Hmm.
In addition to, there's other things that we're working out on a regular basis as a church around common vision and our understanding of theology and who God has called us to be. And so I think one of the things that small congregations are going to need to really work on is, how do we remain invitational? How do we engage people who are not part of our congregation in the conversation about who Jesus is? How do we offer an experience of Christian community that can be meaningful to people who are testing out, who are not certain, who are at a point in their journey where they're not kind of settled somewhere?
Hmm.
Um, I think that's going to be hugely important for small congregations.
Well, you've touched on one of those marvelous new words that we're living with, deconstruction. How do we deal with people, and particularly around us more and more, that have um, gone out of the faith or have themselves never had the faith? And as you say, how do we invite them in? How do we as small churches particularly deal with that approach to a whole different society?
So I think the issue is actually maybe a little bit more fundamental
Okay.
than dealing with a trend or a a term like that.
Hmm.
It's around, how do we have spiritual conversations with each other?
Okay. Yeah.
What does discipleship, what does mentoring mean? And how do we actively engage in that with each other in a way that, is warm, is relational, has some elements of fun in it? The church plants that I've walked with that have really helped people experience healthy Christian community,
Hmm.
they seem to have a lot of openness to wherever someone's coming from, but they also have a centeredness and a groundness. They offer something to people around sort of a spiritual journey, a spiritual opportunity to become more centered on who Jesus is.
Mhm.
And I think the ways we have those conversations and the ways in which we develop those relationships with that as our center is hugely important.
Which comes back to the whole small church idea of we're relational. Do we need to be retaught that? Are we missing something?
Yeah, I've Canada's a big place, and there's a
It,
lot of
it
different
is.
communities with a lot of different community dynamics. And I've visited enough different communities across Canada to realize that I can get in trouble for making blanket statements.
Well, go ahead.
Um, I've had conversations with friends from Saskatchewan who say, "Well, yeah, you just greet someone in the elevator, you talk to them."
Exactly.
That's not my experience in downtown Toronto. You don't often talk to the person in the elevator, right? So I realize there's sort of different baselines for what it means to be friendly, what it means to be hospitable in
Mhm.
different communities. And so I want to respect that. But I think in general, the that those of us who have been born in Canada have a lot to learn from cultures that have a high value on hospitality, that have a high value on relational connectedness. For me, growing up in a farming community, you had contact with your neighbors in part because of shared labor. You offered to help people take
Yes,
the hay off the field during the summer when it needed to get off the field because they were helping you get the hay out of
exactly.
the field. And you have a meal together because you needed to have the meal together to get back out into the field. And um, I really value some of those experiences, encounters, and you had a sort of a sense of being able to depend on each other.
Hmm.
But over time, I think that became more of a like a hired hand kind of function. There became much more of a mechanization, commercialization
Almost a
of
corporate. Yeah,
the
yeah,
family farm
yeah.
for good reason.
Hmm.
They have to operate as efficient businesses in order for them to actually keep in business.
Yeah.
Um, but some of those things that I think caused us to need each other maybe have dissipated a little bit.
Hmm.
And so, what does it mean for us intentionally to develop relationships?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a learned process now that I think personally in my growing up, I was taught the process of hospitality because your parents taught you that and you were part of the community but now how do we learn hospitality? Um,
Yeah. And I think part of the kaleidoscope idea is that different people have different expectations around
okay.
hospitality.
Yes.
And so, how do you develop the sensitivity to, okay, this person, it feels best for them if we go out to Tim Hortons. And this person, it feels best for them if we're able to sit in the front room of our house and have some tea and pass around some desserts and have a conversation,
Hmm.
right? So I think there has to be, I want to use the term intercultural awareness and not
Yes.
apply it just to people who've come to Canada from other countries. But for people who are born in Canada, there has to be that intercultural awareness of that different people have different expectations.
Hmm.
And so, how do we operate in that way that we're asking the right questions, engaging people out of a sort of a sense of humility instead of assuming we know what they need or what they would desire out of a relationship? And it's very exploratory, I think, this time that we're in of getting to know people as individuals and getting to know families as to how they function. It's very exciting in some ways, but there's a lot to learn.
And it's complex, which makes it hard. It's not an easy project if you want to call it a project. And I don't like calling it a project, but for myself, um, trying to learn a new culture, a new place that I'm living in, the person next door is not the person that was next door to me before. And I can't just sort of knock on the door and do the same sort of hospitality thing. It's hard work.
Great if you like learning experiences, because there's a lot of learning experiences to be had.
Yeah.
Um, and We've been very fortunate that we've had a lot of friends who've taken us in and we've had a chance to hear their perspective, on life, and um, some who've moved to Canada from other countries where, we've been given a window into our world that would we have had that opportunity otherwise?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think there's some very amazing elements to it, but I think it does require some intentionality on our part. This loving your neighbor. What does it mean to interact with someone who you encounter and you may not be completely clear on where they're coming from? They may not be clear on where you're coming from, and you start to develop a relationship.
Hmm. Well, I hate to say this, but this fun discussion, which could go on quite extensively, is now over because we're at the end already, and we're gonna have to get back together again and just talk a little bit more about this because I think there is something here to be said about hospitality, about our living in humility in a culture where we would like to say we're the right culture or we come from the right culture. And how do we work together interculturally? There's a lot of this that needs to be explored further, but thank you very much. You have a report coming out. What will we look for? How will we find that? Love to
Sure.
see.
So the one that's just coming out this week is new congregations in the Canadian kaleidoscope.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So those keywords probably will work in a search engine,
Hmm.
but it's the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research that's making that available.
Out of Wycliffe College in Toronto. Okay.
That's correct.
I appreciate that. So thank you. We'll continue discussions on this area at another point, but thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Ron.